Good evening. I'm Molly Duffy, and I'm the director of the Valley Forge Park Alliance. I want to thank you for joining us tonight for the Valley Forge Park Alliance Speaker Series, which is sponsored by the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation. Happy June! It's really hard to believe that this is the last event of our season for this year. Although we will have a season that begins in the fall, so I won't really say year. So that being said, we've been planning already for next fall, and we really want to know what you would like to see next year. We were able to do this all on Zoom this year, which was absolutely wonderful. And we know we'd like to do in-person events next year as well. So please, you're our supporters. Let us know what you would like to see and how you might like to see it starting next fall. And to do that, you could put it in the chat box during this talk if that works for you. So we are busy already planning the speaker series next year, and the Lunch and Learn series this summer has already begun. And I'll share more information on that with you at the end of this talk. So final logistics for our last Zoom for a while. Please put your Zoom session in speaker view. There's an icon in the upper right portion of your screen, your Zoom screen, that should allow you to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. And speaker view is less distracting as it allows you to see only who's currently presenting. There's a Q&A chat during our webinar that can be used to submit questions, like I just mentioned. The Q&A chat icon is at the bottom portion of the Zoom screen. So please feel free to use it anytime during the event. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Mary Lynn Person. Mary Lynn is a genealogist and a member of the DAR. She also participates in the living history community with Morgan's Rifle Corp, as well as being a volunteer with the Valley Forge Muster Roll Project. So I know Mary Lynn because she's one of our very dedicated muster roll volunteers. That's how I met her, and she has been so helpful to us in the time that she's been working with the muster roll. And actually, over the past few years, the Valley Forge Park Alliance has welcomed really what I would say is a second generation of muster roll volunteers who have grown the program tremendously. So Mary Lynn, we're so glad to have you here tonight helping out with this program, and I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Molly. That was a really nice introduction. Greetings and welcome everyone to our speaker series presentation. I am Mary Lynn Person, member of the Valley Forge Park Alliance's Muster Roll Project, dedicated to honoring the soldiers and others who were at the Valley Forge encampment. The muster roll was created in 1941, when transcriptions were made of the original muster rolls in the National Archives. In the early 1990s, the muster roll website was launched. Today, adding new names to the muster roll and proving the patriotic service of your Revolutionary War ancestors is not always a straightforward project. Consequently, we use the tools and techniques of genealogy to help verify the presence of individuals at the encampment. Assisting my aunt in researching our family history to become members of the DAR was the beginning of my interest in genealogy, and so it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's presentation, which is Researching Your Revolutionary War Ancestor. In this talk, genealogist Brendon Burns will explain the approval process for joining the Daughters of the American Revolution and common difficulties that arise in the process. Burns will describe best methods in research methodology and identify useful tools for locating historic records. You may even learn something about how to find your Revolutionary War ancestors at Valley Forge. So, Brendon Burns is a team leader and staff genealogist with the Washington, D.C. headquarters of the National Society's Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR. Burns has extensive experience as a freelance genealogist and specializes in families of the Appalachian region. His research delves into Wachovia Moravians, colonial Tidewater Virginia families, and 18th and 19th century New York genealogy, particularly focusing on westward migration. His expertise includes historical knowledge of the American Revolution, types of patriotic service, and identifying military service records. Burns's professional work includes review of applications for prospective and current members of the DAR Society. Regular job duties include genealogical research and analysis, as well as verification of biological descent from persons who contribute towards the patriotic efforts of the American Revolution. Throughout this process, Burns tackles complex analytical and genealogical situations involving the residence and service of patriots. And I, for one, am really looking forward to learning a lot from Brendon Burns. So I will turn it over, Brendon.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Mary Lynn, for the introduction. My name is Brendon Burns. I am a genealogist with the DAR, as she said. Been with them for 8 years now. And today's talk is going to cover some of the techniques and tips that we at the DAR use in terms of verifying Revolutionary War ancestors, as well as some tips and techniques to work around when there are situations that come up, particularly in situations for new ancestors, as well as conflicts from multiple persons of the same name, and so forth. So I will go ahead and pull up here my presentations. And today, the biggest takeaway that I want to give when it comes to our technique is when it comes to residence. And I'll get to that a little bit here. Basically, breaking down on how residence is the most important aspect when it comes to proving military service. I will go through a wealth of resources here for proving military service. I do want to note that this is going to be a broad topic to cover in general. So some of the resources I'm just going to kind of glance over. Once this is made out in a viewable form later on, you'd be able to go back and record these sources that I have provided here for you. I'll also give a few tips on just how to prove service when you are dealing with the situation of when you have multiple men the same name and trying to sort through conflicts, and also some issues that may exist or arise when you are proving service. Be it note that this is also, I'm approaching this also not just specifically for people serving for the DAR or for membership into the DAR. This can also apply to an SAR situation, or just if you have an interest in Revolutionary War research in general. But taking it from my approach as being a DAR genealogist, what are we looking for when we are reviewing applications? One of the big things is just to make sure that the service that's claimed is correct. The DAR has been around since 1891. We've been through many eras of American history through technology. And as the internet now is making things more available to people, we are discovering that some things have just not been reviewed up to date. So we are reviewing to make sure that the claimed service is correct. We're reviewing to make sure that the service dates are correct, particularly if a soldier died during the war. We're discovering some issues that arise when the full service record has just not been examined, and suddenly we have someone that died in 1812 with the service record of someone that died in battle. So that does create an issue. And as I'll again go in here a little bit more, making sure that the residence corroborates to the claimed service, because there is very much a link to those two. Ensuring that we don't have multiple people the same name in our database that claim the same service. This again is also happening as we are having more people join and technology continues to improve and put more genealogical resources out there for people. And also just making sure that that service record demonstrates the unfailing loyalty, which is the calling card for membership of a patriot, is to make sure that it's free from events of desertion or failure to attend muster, court-martialing, death, etc. You know, Benedict Arnold did good things for the war before he defected, but we don't cherish or recognize people that are like Benedict Arnold. So So the importance of when it comes to residents, as I'll particularly focus on here, is that military enlistment will always corroborate to residents. In residence, in this sense, we are talking about where the soldier was living during the years of 1775 to 1783, which is the recognized time span of the American Revolution. And this serves for historical purposes and genealogical purposes, because when you are establishing a new ancestor, or if you're dealing with a conflict for someone that is established, you want to go for this first before you do anything with service. If it's someone that you can prove through good records that they were born in and died in the same locality, you can make this assumption that that person lived in that locality during the war as well. Whereas if you were dealing with a pioneer going from, let's say, Eastern Pennsylvania to Western Pennsylvania or Kentucky, you will have to probably do a chain of records to make clear of that. And this is particularly the case for when you're dealing with a John Smith or a Thomas Jones, very common names. You're going to want to make sure that you have that trail. Once you've established that residence, then you can begin researching those methods for service. One thing that is important in this, because we are dealing with soldiers, not necessarily over the legal age, is you want to make sure that there's a difference between the military and militia enlistment ages versus legal age. And in this case, when you're proving residence, there's that 21-year age, which has been in use for centuries under English and American law. It's going to apply here as well. And if you're dealing with a soldier that was born in 1762 and services in 1780, he's not going to be able to be found in tax list until a later date, probably towards the end or after the end of the war. So you may also need to go back that extra generation to prove where the parents were in order to prove residence. And especially in those senses where you do have migration that's happening over time, even throughout the war, you may need to make sure that you have that chain of records, but make sure that that chain also makes sense. You're rarely going to find anyone that's going from Massachusetts to Virginia or back and forth unless they were in a seafaring or naval capacity. So you do want to make sure that you are able to support your conclusions when you have this. So how are you proving residence? There's a variety of ways you can do this. You have tax lists, depending on what state or what locality you're in. They could be tithables or ratables, assessments, personal property, land taxes, rent rolls, etc. Again, it's going to depend on your state. Church records, particularly if they had children during the war and they were baptized at a particular location. Church areas membership is going to cover a little bit larger area than a small locality, but it's still very helpful. Deeds and mortgages are generally a go-to. They can be very detailed. They can also pinpoint in some manner a migration if they are moving from place to place. Vital records can also kind of pin a point off of church records, since this is not an era of time when we have required vital records. But especially in New England, if you are lucky to have someone from New England and Massachusetts where they did keep very good vital records, these can help. Court records and minutes and depositions, these are going to be very situational depending on what state you're dealing with. Depositions are largely going to be more from mid-Atlantic areas, particularly Maryland, but these can still be very helpful in assigning age and residence at any one time. But depending on what it is that you're going to deal with, you may need a combination of multiple records in order to make your case. Again, a tax list of a John Smith in Goochland County, Virginia, versus trying to connect into a John Smith in southwestern Virginia is not necessarily going to be set in stone. You may need to, again, use multiple documents. So for this case here, I'm going to mostly focus on military service. I'm not going to get too heavy into patriotic or civil services because that really is just going to lengthen the length of this presentation in general. But when we're talking military service here, largely looking at militia versus continental and state armies and state regiments. I will also talk briefly here about Navy. But for militias, we're looking at locally raised regiments and companies. Most of the time, they did not travel out of state unless the state ordered them to. And there are examples of where this did happen. But militia otherwise was locally raised, and they were raised for local or regional defenses, particularly when you're looking in states from New York South. A lot of them are raised for frontier defense, from Tories, Loyalists, or Native Americans. And they are very location specific, and I will break down how you can tell that here shortly. State regiments and continental line, this is an era when we did not have an organized U.S. Army, but it is the backbone of what became our modern Army. They are not necessarily as location specific as, say, the militia, but there are still some tips on how to identify where they were. But their enlistment spots did draw from a larger area. But they were the first in line to move towards the center of conflict or any battle or in the front in general. So in this case, they were traveling across state lines. There generally is a good record of how these regiments moved versus from militia, where it's going to be based more off of depositions from hindsight. Soldiers, though, that served in the state and continental lines, though, were entitled to bounties, particularly for those who enlisted after 1780. So if you do have a soldier that served in that fashion, it is very much recommended to try and track down those bounties to get more information about their service. And also, if you are, again, dealing with identity, that is very much a good way to help pinpoint that. Talking about location, again, militia is locally raised, and this is very much going to depend on where you're looking at. New England has counties, but counties don't serve a purpose. So therefore, militia companies are going to be raised on the town level. These are based off of quotas, based on population. So Boston's going to have a lot more companies to furnish because they had a larger population versus townships or plantations in the western parts of the states, where they may actually draw up a couple of places in order to raise a particular quota. New York, kind of in between there, they're going to be raised on the town, district, or precinct level. Pennsylvania and New Jersey's are going to be raised strictly on a township level. I will get briefly into a very good site for Pennsylvania and how you can tell where they were from. Maryland and Delaware, you're going to have companies raised by hundreds. Certain areas of Maryland are not called hundreds, they're districts, but it's the same rules. Virginia and point south, though, where it's very much more agrarian, you're not going to have the districts are not going to be well defined or well recorded, but they do tend to correspond with tax districts, particularly in Virginia and North Carolina, but they are within the county level. But again, militia enlistments were strictly within political boundaries for each of the respective states, and they did not march unless they were ordered. New England, you'll see militia marching to the Penobscot expedition or Rhode Island. You will also see militia out of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina marching towards particular conflicts. This is just a screenshot here of the Pennsylvania Archives website. This is a very good one to have bookmarked if you are dealing with Pennsylvania militia. But this one is dealing with the breakdown of militia battalions and companies. And I do have the link at the bottom, which you can go back to at a later point here. But on the right side there, you can see all the different tabs for the different counties. You will note that Philadelphia is broken into city and county. This was before they integrated. But this screenshot here is of the Chester County Militia, and this is specifically just for the 3rd Battalion. And you can see, as it is known, you do have the townships. You do also have the companies broken down into the 1777 and 1780 legislation. So you can tell that if you have someone on a 1777 muster roll under Captain Edward Simonson, they were from Birmingham Township. Whereas we go into the state and continental lines, we're generally going to be talking about enlistments happening within a region, as opposed to a general or a small locality. Let's see. Now, there is no general rule of thumb on residence when it's coming next to a place of enlistment. I've seen where you'll have someone from Fredericksburg, Virginia, enlisting in Williamsburg, but a lot of those are related to the state laws on how they were raised. Particularly in Virginia, they were raised, they were promoting volunteer, but if you did not volunteer, then they drafted you. Orderly books and muster rolls can be a good place to look for trying to give a place of residence. There are those muster rolls that give all that full information, but when you don't have that available, there are some published books out there for state regiments and battalions that do kind of give a history and a timeline, and can also give some information if it's known. And again, this is also where you want to also look for those bounties, because if that soldier did receive a bounty, they could also give some details that might help you out with genealogical and historical details on a timeline. Briefly touching up on Navy services here, this can be a little bit of a trickier animal to deal with because, and especially if you're dealing with people from the South that served in naval fashion, there's just not as many records when it comes to who served on ships, because there was a wealth of frigates and vessels that were out there, but most of the time you're going to have your commanders and masters that are known and your ranked officers as opposed to your seamen and Marines. You will have more though out of the New England area because that was primarily a very seafaring area. But if you do want for proof of service and for at least pay, which is going to be probably the most found kind of record for this situation, you'll want to look through audited claims and accounts through state financial and treasury records. Now, briefly, just going to touch up here on militia and state line enlistment ages, because this is also something that is very important when you're dealing with identity. Generally based off of state laws, and these did get updated throughout the duration of the war as is needed for state quotas. You're generally going to see about age 15, 16 years old to about age 50. Militias will target an older age. You will see them up as high as 65 years. But, and those are going to be largely for New England areas, but you will see for those ages, which were largely relegated to the alarms or the militias, if you were over a certain age, you weren't allowed to march out of the state if you were called. So you will see that much. But for the most part, you're going to see a general 16, 17, 15, depending on the state, up to about 50 years old. Get the rest of the states here. And in certain states, there were some notable exceptions, such as New York, where you had what were called the associated exempts. If you were over a certain age, but you were previously commissioned, you could be called out in time of need. Whereas then, when the state was trying to regenerate their numbers in 1780 after the fall of Charleston, they did have those to try to enlist for the state line, but also for militia, who were entitled to land boundary rights, and those targeted anyone over age 16 unless you were a member of the gospel. And lastly, for Virginia here, they did really try to target those of particular classes aged 18 to 50, particularly in 1777, and who were unmarried and had no children. They were subject to a draft unless they did volunteer or provide a substitute. So when we're talking about sources of service, you've got a broad range here that I'm going to talk about here. And the last one there, the published collections, I will leave to the very end. And again, this is going to be one that will probably need to be touched about later on because there's a lot of books and resources that I have. But talking about pensions and bounty lands, state and federal military collections, state federal claims, and on a more localized level as well, there's county order and town books, which I'll go ahead and start touching up on here. State and invalid pensions are going to be for those soldiers who were wounded in service, or it's going to target for the families of those soldiers who were killed in service. And these are going to be more in the years immediately following the war, as opposed to federal pensions. Collections for these pension records are microfilmed. Several states do also have these published as well, and these can also be very helpful when you're giving details of enlistment, the ranking officers, because often a ranking officer will attest to the service record. And for deceased soldiers, you may also learn familial details. And this is just an example. These are from the Virginia state pensions. These are available on the Library of Virginia website. So we have this example of Harrison Jones. He was a private in the Cumberland County Militia, so we know where he was also from. And his ranking officer, Beverly Randolph, attested that that Jones served under him in the militia and was wounded at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and lost his leg. So these are just kinds of the documents that you may see in these situations. Federal pensions did not begin until the Act of 1818, and they were issued for several decades thereafter, and there were multiple acts that continued to be passed and amended thereafter, largely just because they were trying to specifically target different groups, and also because after a while too, there were over 50,000 people that were pensioned, and it did put a drain on government finances. But 1832, you did see where you were allowed full pay for life if you could prove more than 2 years of service, where you were allowed partial pay for life for those who served between 6 months and 2 years. And I'll go at a later point what happens with those rejected pensions, because if you're looking at a lineage society perspective, not all rejected pensions are created equal, and some of them can pose problems. Widows were entitled to pensions beginning in July 1838, but they had to have been married prior to 1794, and this was difficult in areas that did not keep marriage records very well. But initially, widows were only entitled to 5-year pensions. The Act of 1848 amended that to widows who married veterans prior to 1800. And then for those that were still alive in 1878, 100 years after Valley Forge, any widow whose husband served at least 14 days was entitled to a lifetime pension. These are all available on Fold 3. Ancestry has them, and for the southern states as well, there's revoirapps.org. A lot of the letters and correspondence as well is also included in these. These can be very helpful. The depositions can also be very helpful as well, particularly if it is for a pension that was granted, because these do also give information about marriages, familial details. Some of these depositions came from people that served with the veteran. This is also true of rejected pensions as well. Bounty lands are broken down into a federal and state level, and unfortunately, the federal bounty lands do suffer from record loss. The War Department burned in November 1800, so unfortunately, we only have a register of those who received land prior to that time, but nothing else. And that's unfortunate that we don't have that information. This also includes invalid pensions by the government prior to that time, but there are a collection of those who received warrants after 1800 through the 1840s and thereafter. And these are microfilmed, and these are also available on the Family History Library. They may not always give details. Some of these you may just have the warrant. There is still a large number of these warrants that are also missing. But there are also those that also contain a wealth of depositions and court papers, regarded to people trying to make claims, and is largely especially towards veterans who were deceased by that time. And where those do apply, you can find a wealth of information. But you will also find that anyone who was making federal bounty land claims, many of them also did receive federal pensions, and you will see those documents combined as well. State bounty lands, on the other hand, not every state offered a bounty land because they had to have held a Western claim. Landlocked states such as Connecticut or Rhode Island, New Hampshire did not offer these. But New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, they did offer these additional bounties on top of federal bounties. For New York, for instance, if you enlisted after 1780, which was basically for a lot of these states who they were targeting thereafter, you were offered a minimum of 500 acres on top of the federal 100 acres. So you were private was entitled to 600 acres minimum. Now, these land collections, the bounty lands, they are microfilmed, but most of them are found only in state collections. The New York State Archives has theirs. There are some that can be found on the Family History Library collections, such as Virginia and North Carolina. This is an example here. I know it's probably not going to be viewable to everyone here, but this is just an example of a deed for a bounty land from New York for a Waite Smith. And these are found in what's called the Cuyahoga File Deeds. These are transcripts of deeds that were recorded on a county level that were originally in the Secretary of State's papers. And this on the top paragraph there shows Waite Smith. It's a copy and transcript of his discharge signed off by George Washington, showing that he was a matros in the 2nd New York Artillery, and that he relinquished his claim to his land in 1784 to William Bell. New York, though, did not have any land to offer until they secured the title, which was not till almost 10 years later. They did not offer any bounties up until 1790, 1791. By that time, which Waite Smith had to relinquish his right to that land. And in 1791, we learned in the second paragraph that he was then living in Orange County, New York. So right there, we already have another detail which can genealogically place him in a given area. And from there, you can hopefully follow that paper trail down from that point. So when it comes to state and federal collections, these are going to be the most highly prized, and these are going to be probably the areas where you're going to start. This is going to comprise largely of NARA M246, the Revolutionary War rolls, and NARA M881, the compiled service records. These are all on Fold 3, Ancestry.com as well. These are going to comprise largely of the state and continental lines and troops, as well as any other corps. For certain states as well, you will also find where they are available and were held on a federal level, some militia, particularly in New York. And this is just an example of a recruit list from the Maryland line for February 1782. And these are the kinds of recruit lists and muster rolls that these are the most helpful type, because these are the ones that give their nativity, their residence, their age, physical descriptions, etc. These are the types that we all ideally look for, but not every muster roll looks the same. But this one comes from M246. And then when you look at the M881, which is the index cards to M246, this is for Timothy Campbell of the same muster roll we just looked at, but this is on an index level, so it's going to have the same information. These are just going to be a little bit easier to search. State and federal claims, these are going to be regarding petitions to the state legislatures or legislative bodies for particular forms of relief, whether it be for back pay, property destruction, or for abandoned lands and pensions. And this generally was one of the first parts to that process. These are going to be found on the state level and state archives. A lot of legislative bodies publish their minutes for each year, and this is generally where you want to look for them first before you actually go searching for the papers if they do exist. But they also did have this on a federal level for the House of Representatives. There is something that was called the Revolutionary Claims Committee that specifically addressed any claims for any kind of relief, pensions, or property destruction or reimbursement. These are at the National Archives in DC, but unfortunately these are not microfilmed, but they are. There is a large collection of these available. This is just an example from the state level. This is for New York, the transcript of the Assembly claims, and this is for the heirs of Benjamin Ledyard. And this is for, as the petition will see here, you'll see it covers his service record, but it also goes through the legislative actions of the committee, whether they found it to be true, accurate, or also explain if it doesn't meet their expectations, why, and also the legislative actions taken on it, whether the House voted on it or not. And you do want to follow up on that as well if they did, to see if it was passed, because those are the claims that we do accept. I'll just briefly touch county records, town books. These are again going to be localized. New England is going to have town records or treasurer's records because on the town level, they were also responsible for paying for their own soldiers. Whereas in North Carolina and Virginia, you may find some militia services for more enlisted officers, but you will also find some kind of financial relief on some areas as well that were for militia soldiers that were raised for a particular purpose, and also for families that were in need at the time too. You can also find some additional details on service there. So some tips for avoiding rejections and errors when it comes to an application. What happens when you have multiple men of the same name? Which John Smith is my John Smith? And I feel bad for anybody that has a John Smith, because this can be very tricky. But just how do you avoid finding any errors in service, or when you are trying to prove someone's identity? Well, remembering the key points that I pointed out earlier here. Militia is again going to be very specific on location. If you cannot prove your ancestor resided in that locality, it's most likely a different locality. It's most likely a different person. This is very much true of New Yorkers, especially those that were on Long Island. If you have someone of a name from Long Island, like an Adam Smith, they're not going to be serving in Albany County unless you can prove that that person moved from Long Island to Albany County. So you do want to watch out for that. Pay attention to all the details as well when there's suffixes involved or even prefixes, doctors, deacons, misters, captains, etc. Look for those kinds of things as well. And again, use tax list and county records to kind of help sort people out. If you are in a situation where you can't necessarily find the exact starting point, the residence for a person, look to see if you are also able to find other people of a more distinct name on a muster roll to see if you can try to help find out where they were from. And also specifically look for watching your ancestor's age and make sure that it aligns with the enlistment ages. If your ancestor is 70 years old in 1776, he's definitely not going to be serving unless he was very much needed. State line and continental line, again, want to be looking for the more detailed enlistment records that give the more specific things, but at the same time too, you may also need to look up regimental histories for further details on the history of that regiment. Look into other soldiers of that same company, look through association, cluster genealogy to kind of determine, you know, if there's any kind of history that can be determined. Look through pensions or bounties to kind of help for finding those identifying details and clues. So what issues may cause problems when it comes to service? Well, rejected pensions and bounty claims are one of the biggest issues right there. I'll go to a little bit more detail on that here shortly, but the wrong person performed the service, or the claim cannot be validated. A person was fined, and this is particularly true when it comes to militia because you had to be mustered. You had to show up for muster. And if you did not show up, you were fined. We don't count service for people who were fined for service because even though they may be on a list, well, they didn't show up. And certainly you don't want anyone that was court-martialed for any reason. That's not necessarily a good sign. It's not a good sign today. It's not a good sign then. And certainly you also don't want a soldier who deserted, or you don't want any Benedict Arnolds or anyone that took an oath to the crown or became a loyalist. Those are all things that are all part of examining the full record of a person, not just finding one record and then leaving it to that, which is also a common thing. When it goes, I'll go back to a claim cannot be validated. This is also going to be part of rejected pensions. There are pensions out there that were never fully investigated. On a county level in southern states, they would be recorded in the court order books, but sometimes they didn't make it to the pension office. Well, a claim is just a claim unless it's proven. And there are those ones that are not proven, and therefore we can't accept it unless there's other proof that can help verify that claim. But when it comes to rejected pensions, definitely check out the cause of rejection. And in 1852, there is a book that has been republished multiple times for rejected federal pensions, and that is a good guide to have handy if you can find it. There is an abstracted version of it on ancestry.com. But look for the reason why it was rejected, because a pension that was rejected because that soldier served less than 6 months, we can use that because it's proof that he served. It didn't meet the requirements for pension. But you have the ones that were rejected because they didn't have the full proof as required, or it wasn't validated by any other document contemporary to that time. And it's the same when it also comes to those who are rejected or suspended because the soldier deserted, for further proof from the state records, or even for widows and heirs pensions where they couldn't prove the marriage or the heirs couldn't prove their relationship to the soldier. Those situations, you will want to find contemporary records from the time of the war to help validate that pension claim, because otherwise you will need to continue doing more research to prove that service. And definitely check out those details. This is an example I had from a few years ago. William Doolin, we had a few people of that name, but Dula is also a variation of the same surname. This is from the public view, but initially William Doolin on the left also was given the service under Captain Nathaniel Lame. And unfortunately, in his case, the guy on the right, William Dula, has a rejected pension, whose pension was rejected because the Patriot died before it was claimed. They needed further proof. He died while in that process. But NARA M881 is used there to help prove his claim. And in that case, there are details within that pension that correctly identify that service to that man. So unfortunately, William Doolin on the left, people that are wanting to join through him or descended through him will need to prove services through him and also his residence. And this is just an example from the pension file of William Dula. And these are letters that you can find in the pension files. They are official transcripts from the papers if you do find one of these. But the details within prove when he was born and when he died and where he was living at the time. So we know exactly which man it is and which one it's not. And lastly, because we are talking with Valley Forge today, and so, was your soldier at Valley Forge? You want to definitely go through this process. Again, identify residence and then go through that service record. Muster rolls are going to be dated at a point of camp or a garrison or a fort. So you will have specifically muster rolls that are dated at Valley Forge over a particular time frame. And especially on M881, they will identify the station where they are at. And for that reason, we know, exactly when someone was at Valley Forge. And this is exactly like this is an example right here for a couple people from the 2nd Regiment of Rhode Island, the Rhode Island state line. These people dated at Valley Forge throughout 1778. So these are just examples of how they would appear when you are searching for them. Now, this is the last part of it here. I am just going to kind of go over it briefly just to make sure that it's on the record here for everyone. But these are the published collections for anyone that wants further research onto particular states. Many of these sources are available online because they are through older sources, but there are also microfilm in here. So New Hampshire, all 3 of these books, all these series here are available online because they are older sources. You can find them in Google Books or archives.org. Massachusetts, the best source is without a doubt Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors. This also applies to what is now the state of Maine, but was then the Maine District. It was the territory of Massachusetts. 17 volumes long. This covers all the records that you will find throughout the Massachusetts archives. It's still one of the best and comprehensive sources for service in that state. Vermont, you're going to be looking at Goodrich. That is going to title mostly to militia, but there are also some state line in there. Rhode Island, largely we're going to recommend you more towards the microfilm there at the top, the index to military and naval records. It's 20 rolls long. This is on family history. It is going to cover all enlisted soldiers and also Navy. The published book there, Joseph Smith's book, is going to touch more on enlisted officers. So you're not going to find privates in that book. Connecticut, most of all these books are also in the public realm. They are archives or Ancestry or Google Books. Johnston is the most popular one there, but also look into both of the Bates books for information on state line soldiers. And if you cannot find anybody in there, then go into the Connecticut archives, which are microfilm. That's 56 rolls. Those are on the Family History Library, but I believe right now they are still locked for access. So you will need to go to an affiliate library to look those up. New York, I strongly caution anybody using Roberts's first volume of New York and the Revolution because it can be problematic. Because he did group everybody into what regiment they were, but all the officers are listed without any order as to which soldiers serve under whom. And also he treated each spelling variation of every person as a separate entity, leading many people to believe that there were multiple men of the same name. And that's not always the case. So you do want to take that into consideration. But the audited counts there for the New York State Archives, there is an index to this on their website if you want to find out if there's anybody named in there, but the actual images are on microfilm and are only available through them. And for the balloting book for bounty lands, that entitles to anyone that applies to anyone that enlisted after 1780. And I did publish a book last year outlining some of those deeds that are covered on the more county level. Pennsylvania, without a doubt, the best source is Eggle's Pennsylvania Archives. Those are the specific ones there. The military abstract card files, that's 122 rolls of microfilm that are available both through the Family History Library and also the Pennsylvania Archives website. But anyone also looking for just a history of regiments in general for the Pennsylvania, I either lead you towards Lennon Eggle or Trussell there at the bottom. This has some very good histories on the breakdown of the state army. New Jersey, I'm going to steer you away from any published sources because Stryker is very prone to error, but Revolutionary War comp slips and the single citations there, you have over 140, 150 rolls there total to go through. If you are dealing with anyone from that state, these are on the Family History Library. Delaware, the Delaware Archives there at the bottom, 3 volumes of state and militia service there. Those are available online. Maryland, in their gigantic series of published material, there is volume 18 of the Archives of Maryland, specifically touching on just state line. Clements and Wright, though, is a very good source when you're dealing with anyone from militia. Virginia is going to have a lot of resources. Gwathmey is a good encyclopedia, but it is also very much prone to error, and this is specifically on a militia level. Watch for Augusta County, Virginia, because he did unfortunately draw from the court-martial minutes, and that's not proof of service. That's proof that they were either court-martialed or fined. But if you're dealing with anybody else for state line or continental line, you might want to get better use out of NARA M881 or M246. But Gwathmey is still a good encyclopedia. But any of those other sources there, Brumbach or Burgess, those are all available online as well. And those are very good sources, particularly towards bounties. And also a very good source for anyone with Virginia is Sanchez Saavedra. That's a very good breakdown of the state army and also enlistment points for if they are known. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the state pensions are also available online at the Library of Virginia. North Carolina, we're getting points further south. It's going to be much harder to actually find a full service record in these areas because of just the nature of how records were kept. But look for the pay vouchers and army accounts. These are all available online. And also there is the roster of soldiers by the North Carolina Daughters of the American Revolution. A copy of that is also available online. South Carolina, again, you're going to deal with mostly proof of pay after the war. When it comes to these areas. Stub entries is one area to look at, but I strongly point people towards the audited accounts at the bottom. It's 164 rolls. Those are available on Family History Library, but they are indexed also on the South Carolina Archives online. And lastly, when it comes to Georgia, dealing with primarily more bounty lands when it comes to after the war. Any of these are good resources for that though, but you will also find some militia also found in Robert Davis's Georgia Citizens and Soldiers. And for a more general level here, just kind of briefly scan through. Boxtruck is a very good guide to anyone that received a state bounty. It's basically just an index. It's not going to give many details, but if anybody was entitled to a state bounty land, they're going to be found in that book. And Heitman's Historical Register is a good guide for anyone to have for anyone that was an enlisted officer anywhere in a militia or continental fashion. And the last slip I have here that I have before I go to questions, state resource guides from the DAR. Eric Grunset, former library director at the DAR, put together all of these books for various states pertaining just to records from the American Revolution, from muster rolls to just any kind of published history regarding those specific areas. Some of these books can be very thick as well, but they are very helpful and they cover anything that you can find in a finding aid across the country or even on the planet. Many of these are out of print now, but they are now available on a PDF format through the DAR store, and there is the link right there for that. Militaryindexes.com. It's just a general list of websites and collections for pension lists and muster rolls that are available to the public. And the last one there is revolutionarywar.us. It's a site that I found not long ago, which does cover a good amount of history on the regiments and timelines across all the states, the battles and their histories, further reading, unit histories, appointments, and it also does include enlistment areas. And with that, I leave it to any questions that may exist. And I'll turn it over to Marianne.
Oops. Can you hear me? No.
Yes, I can.
You can. We do have some questions. Let me start with the first one. Where can you find records of persons who sold goods such as salt to the Patriots at the Valley Forge encampment?
So it's going to depend on who was selling them, because that's not necessarily one that can be easily traced. It's going to be more on a state level, and it depends on. You're probably most likely going to find this on the state collections. There are, I'm trying to remember specifically off the top of my head some of the published sources, but those are going to be more on a patriotic service level. Some books, such as there is a book in New Jersey for certificates that were awarded for that case, but as to whether they specifically went to Valley Forge, it may not always necessarily be traceable. So I would check more on the state archives level if you're trying to find anyone specifically providing goods to Valley Forge, and most likely it's probably going to be in Pennsylvania as opposed to other states.
Okay. Next question. Were the names of slaves whose masters forced them to accompany them to the Valley Forge encampment recorded anywhere?
I am not too familiar with many cases where they are in terms of slaves. Because free blacks in general, free people of color were, and even Native Americans were able to enlist in their own right, but it was dependent on the state. For Virginia, I'm not so much the case that there's going to, even other places as well that had enslaved people. I'm not sure that you're going to have anyone that accompanied them mentioned unless they are mentioned in orderly books or some kind of more personal record as opposed to an official record. So it's really going to depend. But I'm not really thinking of right now of many instances where I can think of a case of that right now.
Okay. And then there's another question in that regard. Have you encountered receipts or contracts with slave owners providing hired slave labor of Black Americans in support of the Army?
In this case, again, I have not seen too many cases of this because, again, at this time, slave labor was treated more as property, so they're not necessarily going to be given full pay unless it's a situation where that slave was then freed thereafter, in which case you might be able to find some kind of record of that. But again, when it comes to if that person remained in slavery, I have not come across any examples of a receipt or a contract of that.
Okay. The next question is, oh, I like this one. How do you tactfully inform researchers who are proud of their ancestors' ties that the evidence doesn't always indicate what they had hoped? Example, evidence indicates that their ancestor deserted one unit to enlist in another one with better bounty or overall conditions.
So yes, this is definitely one of those situations where, something unexpected pops up, and it is a situation where it's just, we have, I'm sorry, hold on, pull that video. There we go. It is one of those situations where we have to just tactfully explain the research and the reasons why what we've found is an error, or what is the correct proof. There are situations where it probably is just a little too much for us to prove, that it requires other applicants in the future to prove, because especially with the volume of applications that we have, we can't spend too much time doing much focus on any situation. But it is one of those things where we just try to explain the situation to them, and we try to do our best to lead them right down the path of trying to prove it if they did want to. And if it is an application as opposed to a supplemental, we do try to lead that person towards an easier path if there is one. Some of these it's because we're dealing with a situation where a claim or service hasn't been investigated for years, and it's based off of more tradition or family legend, as opposed to an actual record, and those are more prone to error just because. So
we deal with that a lot with the muster roll, having people that have family lore, and it says that they died at Valley Forge or something, and we can't find any proof of it. So
right. Yeah. And the other part of it too is, the other part of it is that, when you're dealing with a John Smith, and we find that someone died at Valley Forge in 1778, but it's claimed by someone who died in 1812. It's because, there are thousands of veterans that are never going to be recognized in the database of the GRS, the DAR, because that person may not have ever married, and therefore, they're not going to be found. And people have to be cognizant of the fact that there are going to be veterans that are not going to be established for that reason, because you have to be able to prove descent from that person. So that's that kind of confusion as well.
Have you come across errors in pensions? For example, somebody claims that he was at Valley Forge, or he was, in the Continental Army, and somebody else vouches for him. But if you go back and look at the original muster rolls, neither one of them are on them. It seems like a false claim. Have you encountered anything of the sort?
There is some noticeable cases. There are some notable cases out of what is now West Virginia and Lewis County, where there were just some erroneous claims made, and a federal investigation was made, but into fraud. But only a few of them were actually found to be fraudulent. But in terms of actual other cases that can't be proven otherwise, I haven't really come across any. I mean, I do know that, there are those pensions where someone's claimed to serve under someone, and you try to go find the actual muster rolls from that regiment, and you won't find them. But that's also assuming that we also have every document that existed from that time, and we don't know the answer to that. So, there are those cases where we can't fully go further back on proving that record. But if the pension was accepted and they received a pension, we generally leave it at that. Okay. Because we trust that the pension office and War Department fully examined that claim.
Sounds good. I like that. One last question. To what degree do companies in the Continental Army have region-specific recruiting districts?
Going to be dependent on what the laws were in each state. Virginia is going to be the one I'm going to be most familiar with. And when you're talking about Continental Army, it's going to depend on whether that person was prone to being drafted, and if they were targeted for the draft, and they were specifically trying to get people to volunteer before they were drafted. And so if you were drafted, you were more likely going to have to go to a specific spot elsewhere. And again, I've seen cases in a pension where someone was from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and they had to go to Williamsburg. And driving distance today, that's still 2 hours of a drive. So that's, an unfathomable distance at that time, but it's not always going to be very specific to that. But you will see some instances where a captain of a Continental Regiment is still going to draw people from around his general neighborhood as well. But again, it's going to be dependent on how the state was enlisting people. And it's specifically how they were trying to get people to enlist, whether it be through particular demographics in general. And that's why I ask people when it comes to that, for the states that have a good published history of their state regiments, to examine those, because for some areas you can get more detailed information about this company of the 9th Regiment of Virginia coming from this particular area of the state. So there is some areas where that is known.
Okay, very good. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think that does it for questions and answers. And I just want to thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. And all of those references that you put in there are just going to be invaluable to us. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm turning it back to Molly.
Thanks, Mary Lynn. And Brendon, thank you so much. What a great talk. Thank you for being with us tonight. And we have such great audiences this whole year. You all have the best questions and so many questions. So thank you, because you have made our speaker series all the better as well. So I also want to thank, as I always do, all the volunteers who made this evening possible. So many volunteers make Valley Forge Park Alliance work happen every day. And especially thank you to Justin Clement, as he really has been the driving force behind this speaker series this entire year. In addition to you, Brendon, he's just assembled speakers from all over the country that really made up for the fact that we could not gather together in person at Valley Forge. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, we did already kick off this summer's Lunch and Learn program, which will run every Wednesday at noon through August. And tomorrow is a follow-up on tonight, really. It's titled, Was Your Ancestor at the Encampment? The Valley Forge Muster Roll Project. And it's presented by the Muster Roll Project team. So you will see Mary Lynn again if you join us tomorrow at noon. There is no cost to attend. It's a great follow-up to tonight's wonderful presentation. So, and last, I do want to thank again our very generous sponsor, the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation. thank you all again for participating in the discussion tonight. Join us at noon tomorrow. Join us again so we can continue this discussion. And I also want to thank all the members of the Valley Forge Park Alliance for your wonderful support. We couldn't do anything that we do without your support. So thank you. And last, I just want to wish you a good night from Valley Forge. And I really hope to see you at Valley Forge Park sometime soon. We're planning a lot of great events later this year. Hope to see you. Check out our website for details about upcoming events, as well as for the whole schedule for the Lunch and Learn this summer. And soon, updates for the speaker series, which we think will start in October. So thank you all and good night.